Judge William Clark walked into his courtroom with the same calm precision that had defined his career for years. The large wooden doors swung open as the clerk announced his arrival, and the room fell silent. His black robe flowed behind him, each step purposeful and deliberate. The courtroom was a space of authority and tradition. Marble columns framed the walls, and rows of polished wooden benches reflected the overhead light. The air was thick with expectation as Judge Clark took his seat at the elevated bench. He adjusted his robe, an unspoken ritual, and looked out at the room through his square glasses. The docket for the day was full, an endless line of faces filed in and out, each one with their story, but to Judge Clark, they were just names and cases. A quiet hum of whispers was quickly silenced. With a single tap of his gavel, order was restored, and the proceedings began. The next case was announced. Lena Martin stood when her name was called. She was dressed in a tailored gray blazer, her natural hair styled in a crown of soft curls. Her calm demeanor caught the attention of a few seated nearby, but Judge Clark did not notice these details. He focused instead on the charges read aloud by the clerk. Lena walked to the podium, her movements graceful and deliberate. She glanced at the judge with a quiet confidence, a small but warm smile crossing her face as she waited for permission to speak. Judge Clark gave her a brief nod and motioned for her to begin. Lena explained her circumstances, her voice steady yet humble. She spoke of her dedication to her work and the small misstep that had led to her standing in this room. Despite her words, Judge Clark's focus remained on the technical details of the case rather than the person standing before him. His strict adherence to procedure left little room for nuance. He interrupted her politely but firmly, stating that while her explanation was appreciated, the law required a decision. His tone was neither harsh nor empathetic. It was a tone of routine, a tone that marked this moment as no different from countless others before. The clerk quickly prepared the paperwork, and Judge Clark issued a modest penalty. His ruling was swift and final. Lena's expression did not falter, but there was a brief flicker in her eyes, a momentary shift that was neither anger nor sadness, but something far deeper. It passed almost as quickly as it came. Lena thanked the judge and the court and quietly returned to her seat. While others whispered or fidgeted around her, she remained composed, folding her hands neatly in her lap and waiting for the rest of the session to conclude. Her presence in the room seemed to carry a weight that no one could quite place. As the session ended and the judge left the bench, Lena approached the clerk's desk. She handed over her payment and then placed a small handwritten note on the counter for the judge. The clerk hesitated briefly before nodding and setting it aside. It was a moment so simple that no one noticed. The courtroom emptied and the day moved on, but Lena Martin's quiet strength lingered like the echo of a gavel strike, resonating long after the sound had faded. Judge William Clark sat in his chambers later that evening, reviewing the day's cases. He sifted through the notes and paperwork with the precision of someone who had long mastered the routine. His office was a reflection of his personality, neat, organized, and filled with books that represented decades of legal knowledge. As he reached the case file for Lena Martin, his eyes were drawn to a folded note that had been placed inside. It was handwritten on simple cream-colored paper. The neat cursive read, "Justice is more than a decision, it is a legacy, wear it well." Judge Clark paused, reading the note the second time. The words were puzzling yet oddly captivating. He set it down on his desk and leaned back in his chair, wondering what had prompted Lena Martin to leave such a message. It was rare for defendants to address him outside of their cases, rarer still for such words to carry a tone of neither defiance nor flattery. Despite his curiosity, he placed the note aside and continued with his work. He had no time to dwell on minor details or ambiguous messages. The rhythm of his life rarely allowed space for introspection. There were always more cases, more judgments, more obligations. Later that evening at home, Judge Clark settled into his favorite armchair with a magazine, one of the few indulgences in his otherwise disciplined routine. As he flipped through its pages, a headline caught his attention: "Masterpiece in Motion, the designer behind the roads." He began to read with mild interest. The article profiled a local designer renowned for crafting bespoke garments for professionals and dignitaries. It detailed the intricate process behind her work, the philosophy that guided her designs, and her commitment to creating pieces that symbolized the roles of those who wore them. The name of the designer, Lena Martin. Judge Clark sat upright, rereading the name. He scanned the article more closely, learning that Lena Martin was not just a designer, but an artist. Her work was deeply inspired by themes of justice and dignity. Her specialty was creating judicial robes pieces that embodied the authority and fairness of the legal system. His heart skipped slightly as he read further. The article described her most notable creation, a robe crafted for an esteemed judge known for his unwavering dedication to the law. The description matched his own robe perfectly, the one he had worn that very day in court. Judge Clark leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The woman he had briefly seen in his courtroom that morning was the same woman who had spent hours designing and stitching the garment he wore every day of his professional life. He felt a mix of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and an unsettling sense of guilt. He replayed their brief exchange in his mind, recalling how quickly he had dismissed her explanation, how little he had truly seen her as more than a name on a docket. The note she left behind now carried an entirely different weight. He picked it up again. Justice is more than a decision, it is a legacy. Wear it well. The words resonated deeply in a way they hadn't before. For the first time in years, Judge Clark felt compelled to understand not just the letter of the law, but the humanity behind it. The next morning, Judge Clark arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His thoughts were still preoccupied with the discovery about Lena Martin. Every time he adjusted his robe before stepping into the courtroom, he would now think of her hands meticulously crafting the garment he wore with pride. As the proceedings began, he noticed himself becoming more aware of the people standing before him. He studied their faces, listened more intently to their words, and considered their stories with a depth he had not tapped into in years. He could not shake the image of Lena standing at the podium, poised and dignified, yet seemingly invisible to him at the time. When the session ended, he asked his clerk about the note left by Lena. The clerk hesitated, unsure if Judge Clark was displeased, but he reassured them that he only wished to understand more about the person who had written it. The clerk confirmed that Lena had left the note immediately after her case with no additional comments. Later in the day, Judge Clark sat in his chambers, wrestling with the feeling that he owed Lena Martin something. He realized how rare it was for him to consider anyone's story beyond the narrow context of the cases before him. He thought of the article describing Lena's dedication to creating robes as symbols of justice. How could someone with such a profound connection to his world be treated so superficially? Driven by these thoughts, he decided to act. He asked his clerk to locate Lena Martin's contact information using the records from her case. Though he was meticulous about following procedure, this felt like an extraordinary exception. The clerk hesitated, but eventually found an address for her design studio, which was listed on the official court documents. That evening, Judge Clark stood outside a modest but elegant storefront. The name Lena Martin Atelier was painted in gold script on the glass window inside. He could see mannequins draped in robes and formal garments, the fabrics rich and vibrant. The space exuded creativity and purpose. When he stepped inside, the faint sound of classical music greeted him, along with the soft hum of a sewing machine. A young assistant at the counter looked up, startled by the sight of the judge in his formal attire. The assistant quickly disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with Lena Martin herself. Lena emerged wearing a tailored jumpsuit, her natural poise immediately filling the room. She looked surprised to see him, but her expression remained polite and professional. Judge Clark introduced himself formally, though she clearly recognized him. For a moment, there was silence, as both tried to gauge the other's intentions. Finally, Lena spoke, her voice steady and kind. "It is not every day a judge visits my studio. May I help you?" Judge Clark cleared his throat, unsure of how to begin. "I recently learned about your work, and I realize that the robe I wear every day is your creation," he said. "It is an honor to meet the person who has contributed so deeply to something so integral to my role." Lena's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. Your role carries great weight, and I believe in honoring that through my work." Their conversation began with these words, a tentative bridge forming between two people whose lives intersected in unexpected ways. Lena invited Judge Clark to sit at a small round table near the window of her studio. The space was warm and inviting, filled with soft light that illuminated racks of finished garments and swatches of fabric neatly arranged on shelves. She poured 2 cups of herbal tea, placing one in front of him, before taking a seat herself. For a moment, the judge felt out of place. This was a world far removed from the rigid formality of his courtroom, yet there was a calmness here that began to ease his tension. Lena sat across from him, her posture relaxed and her gaze steady. She seemed neither surprised nor defensive as she waited for him to speak. "I owe you an apology," Judge Clark began, his voice measured but sincere. "When you were in my courtroom, I failed to truly see you. I treated your case like any other without giving consideration to the person standing before me." Lena tilted her head, slightly studying him, before replying, "You followed the law and upheld your responsibilities. I do not hold anything against you." Her words were gracious, but they did little to ease the judge's guilt. He hesitated, then continued, "I recently came across an article about your work, and it made me realize how interconnected our lives are without us even knowing it. The robe I wear every day, the one that symbolizes my authority and duty, was created by you." Lena's expression softened, a faint smile appearing on her lips. "I design robes as more than garments," she said. "They represent the ideals of justice, dignity, and responsibility. I believe that the people who wear them carry those ideals into their actions." Judge Clark felt the weight of her words. He sipped his tea, taking a moment to collect his thoughts before responding. "Your philosophy has given me a new perspective," he admitted. "I have always prided myself on being impartial, but reading about your work and reflecting on our encounter made me question whether I truly embody the values my robe represents." Lena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Justice is not just about making decisions," she said. "It is about understanding the people those decisions affect. That is why I put so much care into my work. To me, each stitch, each fold of fabric is a reminder of the human stories behind the laws we follow." Her words struck a chord deep within Judge Clark. He realized that while he had always sought to uphold the law, he had often overlooked the humanity of the individuals standing before him. For years, his decisions had been precise and logical, but rarely empathetic. "May I ask what inspired you to begin designing robes?" he inquired, curious about her journey. Lena smiled wistfully. "My mother was a seamstress, and she taught me that clothing carries meaning beyond function. What we wear reflects our values and aspirations. When I began my career, I wanted to create something that mattered. Judicial robes felt like the perfect blend of tradition and purpose." Judge Clark nodded silently, admiring her dedication. Her words lingered in his mind, reshaping the way he viewed his role in the justice system. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of inspiration to approach his work with greater care. Their conversation continued late into the evening, each story they shared building a bridge of understanding between two worlds that had collided in the most unexpected way. In the days that followed, Judge Clark found himself returning to the courtroom with a different mindset. The conversations with Lena lingered in his thoughts like an echo, reshaping the way he viewed his role. Every time he put on his robe, he felt its weight not just as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the values Lena had spoken of. He began noticing things he had overlooked before: the hurried explanations of those who stood before him, the nervous shifting of their feet, the way their voices wavered as they tried to be heard. These were not just cases or files, they were people, each carrying a story. One morning, while preparing for the day's hearings, Judge Clark came across a letter. It was from Lena. She had written to thank him for visiting her studio and for taking the time to understand the meaning behind her work. She included a small sketch of a new robe design, one that incorporated subtle details inspired by balance and fairness. The letter ended with a simple but profound message: justice lives in the details. It begins with how we choose to see. Moved by her words, he decided to invite Lena to a judicial seminar. He was organizing the event focused on the evolving role of justice in modern society, and Judge Clark felt that her unique perspective would enrich the discussions. He sent her a formal invitation and hoped she would accept. When the day of the seminar arrived, the grand hall buzzed with conversation. Judges, lawyers, and scholars filled the space, exchanging ideas and insights. Judge Clark stood near the podium, scanning the crowd until he saw Lena enter. She was dressed elegantly, but simply exuding the quiet confidence he had come to associate with her. Lena approached him with a warm smile. "Thank you for inviting me, Judge Clark. It is an honor to be here." "The honor is mine," he replied genuinely. "Your insights have already had a profound impact on me, and I believe they will inspire others as well." During her segment, Lena spoke about the symbolism of judicial robes and their connection to the ideals of justice. She shared her philosophy with grace, explaining how the robes represented not just authority, but also accountability. Her words captivated the audience, leaving many nodding in agreement. Judge Clark observed the room as she spoke, noticing how her message seemed to resonate. Even with those who had spent decades in the legal field, she had a way of blending creativity with purpose, making complex ideas accessible and impactful. When Lena finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. She stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat beside Judge Clark, who leaned over to whisper, "You have a gift, not just for design, but for making people see the bigger picture." Lena smiled. "Thank you, but the real work begins with how those ideas are carried forward." The seminar concluded with a renewed sense of purpose among the attendees. Many approached Lena afterward to express their admiration and to learn more about her work. Judge Clark felt a quiet pride, knowing he had played a role in bridging her world with theirs. That evening, as Judge Clark removed his robe and hung it carefully in his chambers, he felt a deeper connection to it than ever before. It was no longer just a garment. It was a legacy. A week after the seminar, Judge Clark found himself thinking about Lena's speech and the way it had resonated with the audience. Her ability to connect the symbolism of judicial robes with the ideals of justice had stayed with him. He realized that her perspective was not just a creative insight, but a call to action. One afternoon, as he reviewed a particularly complicated case, he found himself pausing. The defendant was a young man caught in a web of circumstances that had spiraled beyond his control. As Judge Clark read through the details, he recalled Lena's words, "Justice begins with how we choose to see." Instead of focusing solely on the charges, he decided to dig deeper. He requested additional reports and spoke with social workers involved in the case. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the robe as not just a symbol of authority, but a responsibility to truly understand the lives affected by his decisions. His ruling that day was different. It included not just penalties, but also measures to provide support for the young man, ensuring he had access to the resources needed to rebuild his life. The courtroom murmured with surprise, but Judge Clark stood firm in his belief that justice must be both fair and compassionate. Word of his thoughtful decision reached Lena, who sent him a handwritten note. It read, "I am proud to see your actions reflect the legacy you wear so well." It was a simple message, but it filled him with a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Lena's studio had grown busier since the seminar. Clients began reaching out not just for her designs, but for the deeper meaning she infused into her work. Her reputation as a designer who valued integrity and purpose spread through both the legal community and beyond. One day, while working on a new design, Lena received a surprise visitor. It was Judge Clark standing at her door with a hesitant but hopeful expression. He carried a package wrapped carefully in brown paper. When Lena invited him inside, he explained his visit. "I wanted to thank you not just for your work, but for helping me see the greater responsibility I carried," he said. "This is something I thought you might appreciate." He handed her the package. Inside was an old book, bound in leather with the title, "The Principles of Justice in Boston Gold." It was a collection of essays written by prominent legal thinkers over the centuries. The margins were filled with notes made by Judge Clark during his early years on the bench. Lena ran her fingers over the worn pages, touched by his gesture. "I will treasure this, thank you." Their conversation turned to the future. Judge Clark spoke of his desire to create more opportunities for dialogue between the legal system and the community. He shared his idea of starting a program that would bring artists and professionals together to explore the intersection of justice and creativity. Lena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I would be honored to be part of that," she said. That evening, as Judge Clark left her studio, he felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the connection he had formed with Lena was not just a momentary encounter, but the beginning of something larger. As weeks turned into months, Judge Clark and Lena worked closely together on the program. They had envisioned the idea of uniting artists and legal professionals to explore the intersection of creativity and justice became a shared passion. It was a chance for them both to bridge the worlds they knew so well and to inspire others to see beyond the surface. The program was set to launch at a local community center with an exhibition that would showcase the work of both judges and artists. Lena's role was to help design the event space, transforming it into a visual representation of justice through art. Each piece was carefully curated to reflect the principles that Judge Clark had come to understand so deeply through his conversations with her. The day of the launch arrived, and the community center was filled with energy. The walls were lined with powerful pieces that captured the essence of fairness, balance, and humanity. There were sculptures, photographs, and paintings, each telling a story of justice from different perspectives. Judge Clark walked through the space with a sense of awe. He had attended countless events throughout his career, but this one felt different. It was not about laws or rulings, it was about the shared human experience and the desire to create a world where everyone was seen and heard. Lena greeted him with a smile as he approached one of the larger displays. She had designed a large mural that depicted a diverse group of people standing together in front of a set of scales balanced perfectly in the center. The mural was meant to symbolize the collective effort needed to uphold justice in all its forms. Judge Clark marveled at the mural. "It is breathtaking," he said. "Thank you," Lena replied. "It was inspired by the idea that justice is not just one person's responsibility, it's a collective effort, and it begins with how we choose to see each other." The event was a success as the evening unfolded. Guests from various walks of life gathered to discuss the pieces and share their thoughts on justice. Lena's vision had sparked something in them. It had opened their eyes to the ways in which art could communicate complex ideas in a way that words alone could not. Judge Clark found himself engaged in conversations he would never have expected. He spoke with artists about the role of creativity in society and how it could influence legal reforms. He discussed with community leaders the importance of fostering empathy within the justice system and how something as simple as a carefully crafted robe could symbolize a judge's commitment to fairness. As the night wore on, Judge Clark looked around the room at the diverse group of people who had gathered. There was no longer a divide between the courtroom and the creative world. It was clear to him now that justice and art were not opposing forces but complementary ones. At the end of the evening, Lena and Judge Clark stood side by side, looking at the mural. They both knew that this event was just the beginning. The program would continue to grow as more people joined the conversation, more minds were opened, and more hearts were touched. Lena turned to him with a smile. "This is just the start," she said. Judge Clark nodded. A new chapter for justice. Months passed since the successful launch of their collaborative program, and Judge Clark found himself looking at his work with a renewed sense of purpose. The connection between justice and art had sparked something profound within him. It was as if a door had opened to a new way of seeing not just the law, but the people whose lives were shaped by it. Each day as he entered the courtroom, he felt the robe he wore with a different awareness. No longer was it just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of the values he and Lena had discussed of justice as something human and shared. He found himself more present in his decisions, more attuned to the nuances of the cases before him. He began implementing changes in his courtroom inspired by the conversations he had with Lena. Judges and lawyers who had once seen the law as a strict set of rules now understood its potential to be a tool for empathy and compassion. He worked to create programs that offered alternatives to incarceration for those who needed support, not punishment. Lena's work continued to thrive as well. She had expanded her design studio and was receiving commissions not only from judges but from community leaders and activists who saw the power of her designs to reflect the values they sought to embody in their own work. Her robes were worn by leaders who understood that true justice began with understanding the people they served. One afternoon, Lena invited Judge Clark to visit her studio again. She had been working on a new project inspired by their conversations. This time, she was designing a collection of robes that were meant to be worn by community members as symbols of their involvement in the justice system. She called them robes of participation. These robes were designed not for those who ruled, but for those who were part of the process. those who were affected by the decisions of the court, and those who sought to make a difference. Lena explained, it's a way to honor the voices of the people who are often overlooked in the system. Judge Clark was struck by the idea these robes would symbolize the active role of every individual in the justice process, the importance of participation in shaping a system that worked for everyone. It was a radical idea, but it was also profoundly human. As the months turned into years, Judge Clark and Lena continued to work together. The program they had started grew into a movement that spanned beyond their city. In communities across the country, people began to see the law not as an impersonal system, but as a reflection of the society that created it. It became a system that sought not only to punish, but to heal and restore. One day, as they stood together at the opening of an exhibition featuring the robes of participation, Judge Clark looked around at the crowd of people gathered. Each one of them was wearing a robe of their own, symbolic of their active role in shaping the world they wanted to live in. Lena turned to him with a smile. "This is what justice looks like," she said. Judge Clark nodded, knowing that the journey they had started together was far from over. It was only the beginning of a larger conversation, one that would continue for generations to come. And as he stood there surrounded by the robes of participation, he knew that justice was no longer just something he dispensed from the bench. It was something they all shared together.